Okay, I think we're going to get started. People are slowly joining, but for all of you here, hello and thank you for joining us tonight virtually at Holy Blossom Temple for our panel on COVID-19's unique impact on women when staying at home is not safe. My name is Jill Witkin, and I'm on the board of directors of Holy Blossom Temple, and I'm the vice president of the Department of Tikkun Olam, meaning repairing the world. And this evening's webinar is brought to you by Holy Blossom's Women's Advocacy Group. And this is our inaugural event. As women, we feel that it is our collective responsibility to improve the quality of life of women, children, and families in the broader community. And we can do that in part by forming connections with those working in the field to address these issues, and also by putting on educational events such as this to keep everybody informed and alive to the issues. So today, in the time of COVID, we are in very unprecedented and unpredictable times. Our city is in lockdown. People are told to stay at home, to work, to take care of children, to isolate. Now, for many of us, the challenges range from not being able to take care of and see elderly parents, from trying to find a quiet space to work at home, and even trying to figure out how to work Zoom, not to mention the economic fallout. But for others, like women and children who are experiencing domestic abuse, the isolation only intensifies the torment. I've heard it described as a pandemic on top of a pandemic. I mean, if someone is trapped at home with their abuser, do they have anywhere to go to seek help? Can they easily talk to someone or call the authorities? And what, if anything, can friends and neighbors do to help? And more importantly, what sort of impact is there on the service providers that are there to help them? So these are some of the questions that I'd like to explore with the panelists over the next hour. And I'm delighted to introduce our guests who graciously devoted their time and expertise for this program. We've asked them here as respective experts in the area of child abuse, domestic abuse, and sexual assault, and it's an absolute treat to have them all here together. So first, I'd like to introduce Pearl Reimer. Pearl is with Boost Child and Youth Advocacy Center. It is the first child and youth advocacy center in Ontario. Been around since 2013. Prior to that, it was Boost Child Abuse and Prevention. And she's the Director of Research and CYAC Development. Pearl has dedicated over 30 years to the field of childcare, child abuse, and children's mental health. She was the co-author of the first Canadian textbook on child abuse, and she designed the first child abuse course to be offered in Ontario on early childhood education. She works as a consultant, an instructor, and a research coordinator, and she's developed and implemented training programs across Canada for things like high-risk home visiting programs to online child abuse training, and now she's leading a national webinar series to build capacity for other child and youth advocacy centers. Janice Shaw is with Jewish Family and Child Services. Janice has been a social worker for 22 years, and she's been with JF&CS since 1999. She's worked in the Child Witness Program, the Separation and Divorce Program, and the Changing Family Program. And she's worked extensively with children, youth, and adults. Since 2004, Janice has been the manager of the Women Abuse Program, which is a trauma-informed program offering individual and group counseling support for both women and children. Tamar Whittleson is with the Barbara Schleifer Clinic. And Tamar started her career working for a decade over a decade actually, in television news and current affairs. And then she went to law school and ended up clerking for the Supreme Court of Canada. As a lawyer, she's been working for almost 2 decades in various areas of social justice, including union-side labor, human rights, and constitutional law. And before joining the Schleifer Clinic, she was legal director at MetTrack Action on Violence, which is an organization that works to end gender-based violence across communities through education, research, and policy. And she headed up their community justice program. Now she's the Director of Legal Services at the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic. And for those of you who don't know, Barbara Schleifer was a promising young lawyer who in 1980 came home from her call to the bar and was sexually assaulted and murdered in the basement stairwell of her apartment. And the legal clinic was established by her friends and her would-be law partners in her honor. So I'm delighted to welcome again our very, very talented group. And I'm going to ask them some questions, but I want everybody to know that we are going to reserve some time at the end of the session for a question and answer session from you. So if you have questions that you want to ask, we're going to open up the chat line a little bit later in the hour, probably at around 8:40 or so, where you can type in your questions. And the way you do that is if you go to the bottom of your screen, you will see that there's a black bar at the bottom, and there's something that says chat. You'll see it looks like a little voice bubble, and you can just press that and you can send a message to everybody with your question, and then that question will be relayed to the panelists. So write down anything that you think you want to ask them, and they're happy to take questions on the spot. So I'm going to start now with the panelists, and I want to ask each of you as frontline professionals, can you each take a few minutes and just tell us a little bit about your organization, what it looked like before COVID, and now how COVID-19 has affected both your clientele, whether it be children or adults, and also how it has impacted on your service delivery. Pearl, let's start with you.
Thank you and welcome everybody. So Boost Child and Youth Advocacy Center is a not-for-profit community agency, and we provide programs and services to children, youth, families, and the community where abuse or violence has occurred or there's a risk of abuse or violence. We have been providing services in the community for over 37 years. Jill mentioned that in 2013, we became a Child and Youth Advocacy Center. So we are all under one roof, a multidisciplinary team, all trauma informed, to provide services from investigation, prosecution, treatment, and prevention. So we have with us police officers, child protection workers, medical services, mental health clinicians, advocates, and we also have the BARK program, which we have 3 facility dogs to help our clients. We have a whole range of programs. The prevention education program, so we design and deliver training to individuals who work frontline with children, youth, and families. And we also have evidence-based prevention programs for children from kindergarten right through grade 8. So for that program, we cannot provide live training, which we do on a regular basis. We've been able to provide some virtual training during COVID, but nowhere near the amount of training that we normally do. And the other issue during this pandemic is we're no longer in the schools. Our prevention programs are largely implemented through the school boards. And our biggest concern is that children no longer have their circle of protective adults that they can talk to, or that can keep an eye on them, if you will. So they don't have access, or very limited access, to their teachers, to childcare staff, even to their neighbors, the parents and caregivers. And so we've seen a huge decrease in calls to child protection, 30 to 50% decrease. And that's actually across the country, because they do communicate with all the child and youth advocacy centers across the country. Then we have an assessment-directed therapy program. So through that program, the clinicians provide assessment and treatment for children and youth. And we provide individual sessions and group sessions. And then we have the Child Victim Witness Support Program and our advocacy program. So through the Child Victim Witness Support Program, we are preparing and advocating for children and youth who have either experienced crime themselves or have been witness to a crime, and not just child abuse cases, but any kind of crime. So we help to prepare them to testify in criminal court. We don't do what the Crown attorneys do in terms of helping them understand about testifying, but actually a big goal is to understand what their fears or anxieties are about going to court, and to try and allay those fears, and to help prepare them in that way. It's an education-based program. And then our advocates are supporting children, youth, and families who come through the Child and Youth Advocacy Center and are connected to an investigation of some kind. So the biggest impact for our clients and all of those programs is that we can no longer provide on-site, face-to-face counseling sessions, supports. So we have moved to telephone counseling, and we will soon begin counseling with a chosen platform, but there are a lot of issues which we'll talk about later in terms of privacy, confidentiality, access to the technology, etc. We also have staff who specialize in children and youth who have experienced human sex trafficking. And their needs can be very great, including basic needs. So it's much more difficult during this time to help them secure food and housing. And because all of the courts are closed, there's an enormous amount of anxiety, particularly for human trafficking victims, knowing that their cases have been postponed and not knowing when they're going to be scheduled. We have the Internet Child Exploitation Provincial Counseling Program. So this is a program that provides support and funding through the Ministry of the Attorney General. So Boost manages this program, and so what we do is we maintain a registry of service providers throughout the entire province. So there's an intake process, as with all of our programs, and once accepted into the program, the coordinator of the program matches up victims of technology facilitated exploitation with a service provider in their area, anywhere in the province, and then manages the funding that's provided for the counseling. So the impact of COVID, and I think people are probably very aware of this, is kids are spending a lot more time online, both for school and also many of our children are bored. They have more time to discover apps, websites, and so the impact of this is that facilitated technology exploitation has actually increased significantly, and we've seen that in many jurisdictions throughout Canada and in other jurisdictions. And so I do encourage people, because of this, not to discipline children by taking away their technology. I know we're afraid of online exploitation, but the technology is really important for a lot of our kids in order to keep those connections and to continue to do their schooling. So that's a very brief outline of our programs and services and some of the impacts because of the pandemic.
Thank you, Pearl. Janice, how about you? How about Jewish Family and Child Services?
Thank you so much. I want to thank you so much for inviting me to this really important community event. I just want to correct something Jill said in the introduction. I've been managing the domestic violence program since 2014, but I've been working in the women abuse program at the agency since 2000. So Jewish Family and Child is an integrated agency, which means that we are both a Children's Aid Society, mandated provincial service, as well as a family service agency with a whole whack, 36 programs during non-COVID times on the family service side, on the voluntary service side of the agency. Currently, the agency, remarkably, we're able to have more than half of those programs running virtually, online, through telephone, including one group called the Social Network, which reduces isolation wildly for certain people in the community. So that's fantastic. Our central intake office, which is the front door to the agency, has been receiving many more calls in certain areas of service. So in the areas of financial assistance, because some of the reasons Pearl was discussing, and I'll be talking about later, there's been a huge increase in the need for Holocaust respite services in terms of financial support, hospice support, Holocaust services, and anxiety issues. We're discovering that's new, but we've got a lot of phone calls with people who are calling, they're just having trouble managing during COVID for any number of reasons, not necessarily abuse related, but just in general. As Pearl was saying, there's a reduction in child abuse reports, and similarly with domestic violence. It's part of what the media is calling the eerie silence going on out there, which is kind of scary for those of us working in the field. So having said that, the Women Abuse Program at Jewish Family and Child has different components. So the biggest and primary component is the individual counseling. We also have a children's component, which is the Here to Help program, which is a provincial program that's throughout Ontario for child witnesses of domestic violence. And there's also a transitional and housing support program, which is through the City of Toronto, through Housing Connections, and that helps women get safe and affordable housing. So those are the three components of the program. There's 13 full and part-time staff, including our children's worker, and they are all right now managing approximately 300 clients between them all. So what's I'm hearing from my staff as far as changes is that pre-COVID, it was really more planful clinical counseling on an ongoing basis. And instead, during COVID, it's shifted into more of a crisis counseling service where our workers are calming women down, trying to ground them, trying to help them stay present in the moment instead of traveling down the what if path, which could be very scary for these women. We've also heard that many of the women are feeling re-victimized during COVID, and not necessarily just the women that are stuck at home with their abusive partners, but in general, the lack of freedoms, the lockdown. Some clients who are from other countries where there's war are being re-victimized because of the need to stay home. And this is a population who has a long history of trauma and generally abuse dating back to childhood. So these kind of restrictions are very triggering for these women and their children. One of my staff described it that pre-COVID, they were talking with clients about balancing life work, balancing personal and professional. And now during COVID, it's not balancing this or that, it's juggling a whole bunch of different roles: parent, teacher, worker, wife, ex-wife. All those different roles are becoming more challenging to balance for this population. As far as how the issues have changed, some of the issues are exactly the same as pre-COVID, but the intensity, and they've magnified tenfold at least. So for example, custody and access is always an issue for this population of women post-separation. They worry about things like, will my children be brought back? Are they going to be safe with their dad? Those kinds of issues. And now during COVID, those fears are intensified a lot. And there's abuse happening related to COVID around custody and access issues. So they're exposing children. They're not following social distancing and health protocols. They are they're exposing children and bringing them home to these women for the specific purpose of making them suffer. And that is risky to the children, it's risky to the women, it's risky to other children in the home, anybody else in the home, elderly parents, etc. So another area that existed pre-COVID that continues to be an even bigger problem is the area around child support and spousal support. So that was an issue pre-COVID because many ex-partners would play around with when they would give the money, just so she would be sitting on Schmilkes a little bit. She would be worried. She would be concerned that she wasn't going to get what she needed to pay her rent or food or some basic sundries. And now what some of their ex-partners have decided to do is just not pay at all, not pay the child support, not pay the spousal support. So these women are in very, very precarious positions. We are very, very fortunate that the community is oh so generous, and we've had a few donors who have donated to help mitigate some of these financial costs for these women. But really the need is so great that any amount of funding is just never enough. And the more we can help, the safer these women will be, and the more their basic needs will be met. And that's the goal. So I'm going to stop there. More to come later.
Thank you, Janice. Very informative. Tamar, what's happening at Barbara Schleifer Clinic?
Well, thank you for inviting me as well. I see my last name is not there. I'm Tamar Whittleson. And so at the Schleifer Clinic, just to give you a sense of who we are and what we do, we're a unique clinic in Canada. We're a legal clinic and we provide legal services. We also provide counseling services and other social support services, assistance with housing, and also interpretation services in more than 200 languages. And our client base is women, women-identified people, and non-binary people who've been exposed to gender-based violence. So in terms of the kind of support that we give, we see at least 7,000 clients every year. And then in addition to that, we also do legal and legal advocacy and systemic advocacy work. We found in terms of what's been happening since the pandemic has kind of changed the way that we've been living, we are still getting a fairly regular stream of referrals in the family law area. We deal in 3 areas of law: family law, immigration law, and some criminal law. And so in terms of family, just to pick up on some things that Janice has said, you know, at first we started doing a lot of scrambling to help women understand if their case was adjourned and what that meant. And it is true that for most matters that were going ahead, when the courts decided to close their doors to most of their regular services, the majority of cases have been adjourned. But it's very important, and we're constantly working to get the message out, that the courts are still operating to hear urgent matters. I'm talking specifically about the family courts now. And so we are providing support to help women understand when their issues may be urgent and whether or not they might be able to have that urgent matter heard by the court. It's all still done remotely, you know, by teleconference. And so we provide either legal advice, some representation services. We also assist women communicating with legal aid, because legal aid is available generally. More legal aid is available now. Basically, anybody who identifies that they're a survivor of domestic violence and that's part of their legal issue in the family context, the legal aid rules are that they are entitled to 2 hours of free legal advice and then also representation. So we assist women in getting access to legal aid and also in connecting them with lawyers both inside the clinic and outside of the clinic. In terms of our services related to sexual assault, we have also found in that realm that there are fewer calls coming in. And the ones that are coming in tend not to be related so much with what's happening now, you know, a recent incident, but historic incidents. Now, we know that in the case of sexual assault, the vast majority of people who are assaulted by people that they know, and mostly intimate partners. And so, given the circumstances that we are told to shelter in place, and women are living with their intimate partners, their spouses, there's no reason to believe that sexual assault is not part of the heightened abuse. Where there is a history of abuse, and now there is additional stress from the living conditions, perhaps financial concerns, having children around and having to entertain and school them, and the fact that there is no relief, and there's a lot less opportunity to actually seek out assistance and seek out help and seek out some break from that pressure cooker. We did hear from some statistics that were gathered by colleagues in the violence against women sector, that some of the things that were being identified by women was a fear of unwanted pregnancy. And other statistics that have been collected during the COVID pandemic here in Canada is that 1 in 10 women say that they are either very or extremely concerned about experiencing abuse during this period. So it is this eerie calm that is not, I think, representative of a reduction in violence, but just a hidden violence. And also with respect to sexual assault between intimate partners, this is historically a taboo area. It's an area of violence that is sometimes the hardest to talk about, the most embarrassing or shame-inducing, and so we're trying to get the message out that we are still available to provide legal information about options related to not only abuse in the family context, but also sexual assault. It doesn't mean you have to take steps, but you may need to know what is possible now or in the future. And then there are lots of resources. I think we'll have a chance to talk about that in the remainder of this discussion, but there are places to call to get information and to be connected and to find out what you might do. The last area of the law I wanted to talk about that has changed during COVID is our area of practice with respect to immigration. And so in the immigration realm, although deportations are not going ahead, at least for now, but applications are being received by the government. And so we are assisting a lot of women on an urgent basis to initiate their applications, whether it is for refugee status or for a humanitarian and compassionate grounded application, because if they are non-status, they need to have at least that application initiated in order to have sufficient recognized status to be eligible for the government financial programs, both at the federal and provincial level. So that has shifted the focus in our work and providing assistance in actually helping non-status women either get work permits where they're still able to work or to access the government financial services.
Thank you, Tamar, very much for that. So I want to ask each of you now, for women in abusive situations, first of all, I'm going to address this to Janice and Tamar. For women in abusive situations, this is no doubt a very, very risky time for them. Are shelters still open? And where should a woman turn if she is in trouble? I'll start with you, Janice.
Well, in cases of emergency, 911 is always the very best and first option. And they will always respond. The shelters are open, and there's a centralized number to call who coordinates that, and we can help women navigate that system. Shelters are being required to also follow the health protocols and social distancing, and because of that, The numbers in the shelters are going down. However, they're only going down because some of these families are being relocated into hotels that are not being used right now for safety, and for physical safety and for COVID-related kinds of safety concerns. Having said that, if she's got other kinds of concerns that aren't necessarily urgent, we're able to help. And if she's able to leave in a more planful way, then we're able to help her navigate these systems with the police, we can work with Children's Aid with her and help communicate, advocate in different kinds of systems. So those are probably the main things, but if it's really an emergency, 911 is the way to go, and that really hasn't changed necessarily pre-COVID to COVID.
Good.
So I can just add a little bit there. In addition to what Janice said, you can call our clinic as well. We also do safety planning. They've tried to centralize the access into the shelter system. Another good sort of first connection is the Assaulted Women's Helpline. And these resources are provided to you at the end of this, discussion. My understanding is that the shelters are full, but it's also fluid. Like, women are moving through. Spaces can be found, as Janice said. Sometimes hotels are being used to help house women, and it's not the ideal situation, because then they don't have as much direct contact with the shelter staff, who are extremely supportive as well. But it is an option. And then another thing that we've heard is that in cases where a woman is in crisis and may have some physical issues that has taken her to hospital, if she presents with any COVID symptoms and she does not have a safe place to go, the hospital will admit her, at least on a temporary basis. And then that also facilitates her moving into a shelter space should it become available, because shelters are then reassured that if she's tested negative, there is no need for a waiting period before she can take residence. So those are some of the avenues that we understand are available right now.
Okay, thank you. Pearl, what services are still open for children? And also, can you tell us what is the best way to send a message to children, or what's the best way to talk to children who are struggling throughout this time, even just as a result of the stresses of being at home all the time, not having those safe spaces to go to and those safe people in the community like teachers?
So, as Janice and Tamara have made it clear, police and child protection agencies are functioning as they always have. Kids Help Phone, which is a wonderful resource. They have told us that their calls have increased over 400% since COVID started, but they receive funding so that they've brought on more staff, and they also have a texting service in addition to the telephone counseling. I think a lot of people aren't aware that the children's mental health agencies are also open. And they are doing what Boost CYC is doing. They're providing support and counseling virtually because people can't come into their organizations. There's 2 very good supports for intimate partner violence, and that is Shelter Movers. There's a wonderful organization that helps to move women and children from an unsafe situation to where they're going next. And Safe Pet. We know that a lot of women stay home because they're worried about their pets, and so this is a service that assists with finding fostering of their pet for a certain time period, so that doesn't impede their wanting to leave. So those are the key services right now for children and youth and their families. And so some of the key messaging, I think that's important is, and not everybody can do this, what I'm suggesting, because it just depends on the situation and the stress, but for parents and caregivers to try to tell their children how they are helping to keep them safe and keep themselves safe, because kids are exposed to so much social media, whether they want to be or not, the news, fears, etc. And it's really important for us to help children feel safe during this unpredictable time. I think that we have to give kids the message with respect to schoolwork that that we have to have realistic expectations, and to tell our children, you know what, do the best that you can do. And I think that relieves a lot of stress for parents and caregivers also, because if you have these expectations, many of which are just unrealistic during this time, we get more stressed out, and then that has an impact on our kids. So just accept what they can do and what you can do as a caregiver with all these stresses and kids in the home. Take our lead from our kids. They will ask us questions, and there's a lot more anxiety with children, as you can appreciate, not just with their parents and their caregivers. And so to try and answer their questions in according to their age, where they are developmentally, offering strategies to help them with anxiety, and the resources that your listeners will get at the end have some really, really good suggestions and resources for that. Kids want to be helpful. That's usually their nature. So try to engage them in any way you can to be helpful, even if it's drawing a picture and taping it to the window, something positive. We've seen a lot of rainbows, those types of things, because not only do we as adults feel powerless and fearful during this time, but so do our kids. And it gives them a bit of a sense of, well, I'm doing something to help my family or help my community. And my last suggestion, which we should be saying to kids all the time, is come and talk to me. If you have questions, if you have worries, and make it okay for them to go to someone else. Say to your kids, you know what, it's okay if you don't want to talk to me. Let's think about who else you could talk to if you had a worry or a problem. And so kids then will feel, if they're able to reach out, they've been given permission that they can talk to other protective and safe and trusting adults.
Great. So I want to just move on quickly now to communication. You all have your respective ways of communicating with your clients, whether it be on the phone or in writing. And I want to know, are there factors that you've had to take into account now with COVID that may change or modify how you communicate with your clients? I'll start with Pearl.
So confidentiality is a huge issue when they come to the agency. Their time with their advocate or clinician or court support person is completely confidential. They've lost that to a great degree depending on their home situation. They, as I think it was Janice that mentioned, the kids are trapped at home, if you will, many of them trapped with the person or the people who've hurt them. And this is also can be very triggering, and it can also be triggering even if they're not at home with the person who's hurt them, but it's a reminder of the abuse in many cases where they're in a situation being hurt and they can't easily get out of that situation. So there's a lot of triggers. And not all of our clients have access to cell phones, to computers, particularly our younger clients. I mean, we start serving clients at age 4, for the court support program age 3. And so the younger kids, they don't have access like they do when they come to the agency. So we really worry a lot about about our clients.
Tamar, can I move to you? What are you seeing in terms of women and communication when they're stuck at home with their abuser?
Well, certainly the challenges are greater. Similar to what Pearl said, there are concerns. It's harder to find time when they can speak freely, and they're either, out of earshot from their abuser or even their kids, either because it's not appropriate for their kids to be hearing these kinds of conversations related to custody and, the behavior of the other parent, or it's just that they are distracted. Our clients, they have to look after their kids. So it's harder to find a time when we can talk. It's also, we're finding that it's harder to keep appointments, and a lot more appointments are missed. And so we just have to, in our trauma-informed way, remember that it's just going to take more calls and more patience. Some of the tricks that, or, sort of strategies that our lawyers have used, getting women to think in advance when they actually can plan to have some time to talk confidentially, whether they can go for a walk or when it's, when their partner, goes out for a smoke, when they go grocery shopping. Sometimes it has to be that we frame our questions so that we get a yes/no response, so that they're not talking about too much in a public space, but at least we start to get the information that we need, perhaps on intake, and then we can follow up with another call. Sometimes there have to be just more calls in sort of more discrete chunks. We have We've also encountered clients who either they're worried about an abusive partner gaining access to their email or their text. And so we have to be even more vigilant about how we communicate. A measure of control is that partners can actually take phones away and cut off that access to the outside or damage phones. We have been given donations of phones from some of the phone providers that come with data. And so where we find that we have a client who really needs, on an urgent basis, to continue to have access for either an ongoing legal matter or a counseling matter, we can make arrangements to get a phone to her. I mean, it's not an unlimited supply. We are still actually prepared to address, women who drop into the clinic. There haven't been very many. I think slowly, as the restrictions start to lift, some may come, and under the current circumstances, we have we have a phone set up outside. We can talk through windows, but we've had to be strategic, and it is certainly more difficult. And then, of course, just to identify, some of our very marginalized clients, they don't have access to internet, they don't have computers, they don't have good facility with the technology that they do have. So, it has certainly presented challenges.
Janice, do you have anything to add?
Well, some of the concerns certainly cross over. One of the things that we did in the counseling part of the agency is all of these staff put the same message at the beginning of COVID in terms of what to include when the women leave a message. So a safe time to call, if the safe number has changed, that sort of thing. Once we do touch base with the women who are still living with their partners, one of the first things we do is develop some kind of code word, something very simple, that if she's in trouble and she needs help, then we will call the police on her behalf to get some intervention. The second thing we do is we come up with a phrase for her should the abuser walk into the room or come back inside from the smoke or playing with the kids or whatever. So very often it's, "No, I don't really want my ducts clean, thank you," and hang up. So as Tamar was saying, because we too are a trauma-informed program, it just takes longer to get to the same place that we would have gotten pre-COVID. But the women now, wherever they were pre-COVID, it's clinically a backslide back to almost the beginning of service in terms of the issues that are coming up for them. We're currently only using phones in the program because this is also one of the issues that is consistent pre-COVID and has intensified post-COVID, and that's the whole issue of technological stalking and surveillance of telephones, of computers, of hacking. So we're, as an agency and staff, are very conscious that we don't want that to happen and put the women at further risk of harm. So also having our numbers blocked means that if she has to hang up, he can't do the *69 and see who was calling. So that's a safety measure both for the client as well as for staff. So that's all I'll add to that piece, but it's definitely more challenging for those women who are at home because you end up speaking to them in little snippets over many, many days.
And that's good advice, I think, for members of the community who may be communicating with someone that they suspect may be in trouble. And on that note, I want to ask you all, we have to be concerned about the families who are around us, even if we are safe. And as members of the community, we want to keep our eyes and our ears open. So what are our legal obligations with respect to abuse that either witnessed or suspected? And I want to know, is it different in relation to children versus adults? So let me start with Pearl and just ask you, what is an individual's legal obligation when it comes to child abuse or suspected child abuse? If someone has a concern with it, what should they do?
So everybody in our province, professional, non-professional, we all actually have a legal responsibility to call a child protection agency if we're worried about the safety or well-being of a child. And it's a lot of people ask themselves, well, I don't know if what I'm seeing or hearing or worried about is child abuse. Well, it's not our job to know that or decide that. And child protection agencies are very pleased and open with people who call them to chat, to consult, and to say, I'm worried about this child, but I don't really know if this is a protection issue. And then the worker will, ask them questions and walk them through the call. And I think one of my biggest messages is I really believe in gut feelings. And if you have a gut feeling that something isn't right, then call a child protection agency and talk to them about what it is you're worried about. Because usually our gut feelings are telling us something. It might not be child abuse, but there's something that's just not sitting right. So we have a legal and a moral obligation to follow through.
Okay, and just very quickly, Tamar and Janice, what are our responsibilities with respect to adults if domestic abuse is suspected? Tamar, I'll just start with you, and then we're going to open it up for questions after this. The chat room, I believe, is now open. If people want to write in some questions, they can do that, and we'll get to it as soon as we finish these questions. Go ahead, Tamar.
So there's a very important legal distinction, and that is that there is no legal responsibility to report suspected abuse of a woman or an adult. And we who support survivors of violence are always walking that very difficult but informed line, considering the potential risk that could occur if, in fact, you do heighten the surveillance, if you get police involved. And it's really important to understand what the woman's wishes are, because there are often very many good reasons why a woman is not ready to leave. And it might be even more so in the time of COVID, where this is going to either create more complications in terms of where she's going, where the children are going. If If the abuser feels that that he is facing some sort of a separation or losing control, we know that that is highly correlated with an increase in violence. And so there is a concern that by intervening excessively without the woman sort of ask for help, it can actually make things worse for her. And so the best thing to do, and I'm only going to go a little down this road because I know Janice has a lot more to add, but it's to open the lines of communication, to be available, to find out if the woman needs your help, if she wants to know if you can provide some services, if you can quickly chat on, when you're walking the dog or in the grocery store. And take her lead, and in a situation where you've got that gut feeling that something is not right behind closed doors, you can knock on the door. You can take over like a loaf of bread, a gesture, something to just kind of interrupt what might be happening, and at the same time make it seem very innocent and benign. What else can you think of, Janice?
All those suggestions are excellent. I just also want to make the point that we also have an obligation, a legal, a moral, and an ethical obligation to report when children are in the home and there is a risk of harm to the children, and we do that very, very often. With respect to Tamar's point, that intervention, if we call police without her knowledge, we could be putting her at far greater risk of harm. Sometimes we feel that way calling children's aid, but we have to, because the additional outside eyes and ears could escalate things, because they're going to leave. And very often, most often, pre-COVID, during COVID, he's not going to be arrested and removed from the home. So the police are going to come, say their few words, and then they're going to leave, and she's going to deal with the fallout, which could often be worse than what was initially happening, because there's been outside intervention and eyes. So I guess that's the only thing I would add to what Tamar and Pearl has already said.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask one very, very final quick question to Tamar. You've already touched on the legal avenues available. The courts are still open, you said, for urgent matters, even though they're done remotely, and your clinic can advise on that. Legal aid normally has a financial eligibility test. Has that changed at all, or is there any new policies with respect to legal aid as a result of COVID?
Yes, so legal aid has announced that during the pandemic, anyone who identifies domestic violence will be able to get either legal advice or legal representation. They do not have to meet a financial eligibility test. And so this is, in principle, a really important thing to take advantage of, to have access to. And don't let anybody tell you, this is another potential sort of coercive tactic for someone to say, oh, the courts are all closed, you won't be able to get any help, you'll never be able to afford a lawyer. Now is the time when legal aid is available for survivors of domestic violence. As well, if you're trying to figure out if you might be able to have a matter heard on an urgent basis, you can also call the Law Society of Ontario. They have a referral service. They always have a referral service, but they have one specifically now that will get you in touch with a lawyer to get some legal advice for free for 30 minutes to help assess whether or not your matter is something that you could actually take to the courts and have it heard now. One other program that they've beefed up is the Victim Quick Response Program, VQRP. This is for victims of recent violent crime. So if you've suffered some kind of a domestic or a sexual assault or other kind of violent crime, this is a service that you can try to access, and they have more funds available, for example, to help you move into a hotel for an extended period of time. We still run our independent legal advice program for survivors of sexual assault, and that's it's a phone service, so it's up and running both through our clinic and through it's a general line through the Ministry of the Attorney General. I think it's just really important to remember that even though we are, under sort of lockdown and many of non-essential services are not operating, don't give up hope. Many of the services, like the organizations that we are representing here tonight, we are continuing to provide services in creative and different ways, and there's a whole network out there. And so don't be dissuaded from reaching out and getting information and accessing supports.
Okay, a question has come in for Tamar. What are considered urgent matters for the purposes of court hearings?
So the courts originally announced that the general categories would have to do with child protection issues, with child custody and access issues, and restraining orders. And slowly, I'm not here to give legal advice, and nothing I've said should be construed as legal advice, but the courts are hearing a lot of issues related to custody and access. In other words, one parent, for many reasons, is not following the order that was given from the courts pre-COVID, and so the courts have said generally, if you have actual evidence or examples of an interruption in contact between child and parent that is not related to real risk, then that's something that the courts are going to intervene on.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's come in, do you think that there should have been consultation with women's groups or at least shelters before the stay-at-home order was made by the government, and how do you think that might have changed things? Tamara, I don't know if you want to answer, if you want to try.
Yes, and in fact, it's interesting because our executive director wrote an opinion piece that canvassed this sort of idea just very recently, and so it's on my mind as well. I think what we're thinking is that, it's now being discussed very generally in Canada and around the world that yes, like the pandemic and the way that we're dealing with the pandemic as a society is having direct and negative impacts in the ways that we've been talking about tonight on women and children. But it kind of came late. It wasn't part of the initial emergency response. And we think that so often if decision makers would consult the stakeholders at the front end, at the beginning, we could have anticipated, for example, that there was going to be an increased need of shelters. And we could have started to put into place, like with hospitals, more beds, more rooms, more, hotel spaces. We could have been thinking through ways of providing service among our agencies for this increased need, even providing us with more personal protective equipment in advance to be able to facilitate more in direct contact when necessary. And then just in terms of another issue about, Janice mentioned that support payments are being cut off either maliciously or because support payors now have their income interrupted. But we're facing a situation where there are government programs to provide financial support when an employee's employment has been interrupted because of COVID. But recipients of child and spousal support who are predominantly women don't have access to those funds, and yet their expenses are continuing and they may not have outside income. And we could have try to think through these things in advance, because when it comes to financial resources, we know that women are also always disproportionately affected in a negative way, in a disadvantaged way. We recognize that there is general feminization of poverty, and it's because women are typically in kinds of jobs that are precarious or part-time or underpaid. And so when something like a pandemic creates upheaval in the workforce, then women who are already working so hard to make ends meet are going to be even more at risk. And it's those sorts of things we could have thought about more with the advice and with the foresight of people who do this work every day. And we're facing problems that haven't yet been addressed, like issues of cutoff spousal and child support.
Thank you. Okay, this is going to be the last question from someone in the group, and then we'll have to round it up because it's already 9 o'clock. And any of you can answer this, and any or none of you or one of you, it doesn't matter. But what do you see as the biggest challenges for your organization and for this issue in general over the next 3 to 6 months?
So
Go ahead,
Janice. Okay. So for, as we've mentioned, we are expecting what's been phrased a tsunami of reports to child protection, and through, some come through the CYC and all our other services. We're just going to be flooded once kids go back to school and they're out and about in the community. And so this is actually connected to the previous question also, is even though we're considered an essential service, we do a lot of fundraising. And because of COVID, a lot of our funding has been suspended. Our big fundraising ball, had to be put off. Some of the grants applications are on hold, et cetera, et cetera. So, we've been concerned through COVID and after COVID that to be able to keep all of our staff. And in fact, we really are, the bottom line is we will need to increase staff to be able to serve all of the children, youth, and families who are going to be needing service after this. And so, we're all doing the best we can, but that's what we're anticipating.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll just add from a service perspective, I'm not really the best person to answer or respond to organizational sustainability right now. But over the next 3 to 6 months, the longer we stay socially isolated, my concern is the impact on staff, because Zooming and doing this kind of work from a distance is very, very stressful on staff. And particularly because they feel helpless themselves and hopeless themselves, because sometimes there's situations that we can't help, where if it was pre-COVID, we would be able to do more hands-on kinds of interventions, but we're unable to do that now. And so I'm very concerned about secondary and vicarious trauma on staff, in a different kind of way than I was pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, it's like incremental thing, of impact of secondary trauma. I'm concerned that during this time, while everybody's working from home, socially isolated, it's going to be more of a crash and burn kind of scenario. So I'm encouraging my staff, don't book so many appointments during the day. It's very stressful. Make sure you try and keep boundaries between your work life and your home life. Use each other for support. Use me for support. Go for walks. The typical kinds of stuff for us privileged folks living in safe environments. So I'm really concerned about the impact on staff across the board, not just my staff, but all the way around doing this work from home at a distance.
And one other element that I think we're expecting on the sort of on the legal front is that, as the courts start to open up and cases start getting rescheduled, there's not only going to be, the sort of the backlog that has to be dealt with, but I think another luxury is when people are no longer, worried about their health, and as the restrictions start to lift, then they can actually start thinking about looking at their legal options where they may not have the energy, the mental, or the sort of the even physical energy to think about that kind of an issue now. So I think cases will increase in terms of women coming asking for advice. And finally, we're going to be tipping the balance where there's all sorts of increased need in the services that we provide, and all of us have lost funding through various sources, whether it's government or fundraising. So it's going to be a real challenge.
And if I can just add one more thing quickly, and that is that when restrictions are lifted, it's not like we can all grab our briefcases and run back to work. We are, all working on a back to work plan, and which takes up time, and finding the best ways to keep everybody safe and healthy and to be able to see clients. And, within the back of our minds, the concern that because they keep talking about a second wave. So starting, and then, how are we going to be able to adapt to, without playing what I call the what if game, but these are still the realities for our agencies and for our staff and our families.
Thank you. I want to thank the speakers so very, very much for your very thoughtful and articulate responses, really important information for everybody. And I want everyone out there to know that the speakers have been very helpful in helping us compile a very comprehensive resource list, which you are all going to receive tomorrow by way of email. It's also going to be posted tomorrow on the Women's Advocacy Group page on the Holy Blossom website, and it's going to be, I think, very helpful with lots of resources with respect to each of the organizations and the contact details there, and also resources for child welfare and gender-based violence. I want to, again, thank you very much, and the Sisterhood, which is the women's group, not our women's group, but the general women's group at Holy Blossom Temple, really values and appreciates the ongoing necessary and important work that you do, and they will be providing a small honorarium to each of your organizations after the fact, and so we thank them for that. And we want to, on behalf of the Women's Advocacy Group, just thank you so much for joining us. We hope to all of you out there to bring more educational events like this in the near future, hopefully in person, if not, then online. So stay tuned for that, and mostly stay safe. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.